In this video, we're going to cover some newspaper articles from the year 1906. And actually, I found these articles in newspapers from London. Now, this article deals with the accident death rate per 10,000 employed. Look at the death rate for seamen, 58 per 10,000. And I would have expected mining to be a little bit higher, but it's not even close. It's almost 5 times more dangerous to be out on the seas. But if you think about it, it actually does make sense because a lot of ships went down in those days, especially when they were crossing the oceans. It was still very dangerous to be out on the seas. They didn't have all of that modern navigational equipment, that radar equipment that could see storms hundreds of miles away. So it was very, very dangerous to be out on the seas. The cure of cancer, wouldn't that be nice? Well, 110 years later, after this article was written, we're still searching for that elusive cure for cancer. And take a look at this first paragraph here. Would 100 million pounds be too much to pay down today for an infallible cure for cancer? That dread disease that keeps the surgeon's knife busy, that is now dragging off in anguish upwards of 30,000 of our people every year. Now you'll see here that the director of the Central Laboratory of the Imperial Cancer Research Fund says that, quote, 4 years ago there seemed little hope of acquiring new knowledge of cancer. In the interval, it had been made the object of systematic experimental study. And the advance in our knowledge now enables us to reproduce at will all the features of spontaneous cancer in mice. And then he goes on to say, this having been achieved, it is not too much to hope that further development of the experimental study of cancer will ultimately yield results having a direct bearing on the nature and treatment of the disease. And then the article gives reason for hope, and we're still looking for that hope today as well. It says right here, the cause of cancer, in the discovery of which lies the only real hope for its successful treatment, remains unknown. But with the progress of science, the discovery has now become a practical possibility. This article still holds a lot of relevance for us today. It is still killing millions of people worldwide, but perhaps in the near future there will be a cure. Who knows? The progress of motor traffic, cars, cycles, boats. And of course, cars had been around for about a decade. So you can see here, this article talks about some of the regulations that have to be passed. They're having to deal with all of these new cars that are appearing on the roads. So the article starts out, on the 14th of August, 1896, the Light Locomotives on Highways Act became law. Notice how they call it Light Locomotives on Highways Act. Now that's sort of interesting. They still couldn't get railroads out of their heads. And then if you sort of go down here, they talk about Emancipation Day, 1896, nearly 10 years ago, was celebrated by a drive from Whitehall to Brighton. Most of the machines were of continental origin. French and American cars distinguished themselves. Few of the starters completed the 50 miles. None did so without trouble. Today, cars will run from London to Edinburgh without changing gear, or from the Mediterranean to the English Channel without stopping. And a carriage of ordinary touring capacity, carrying the equivalent of 4 persons, will maintain an average speed of close upon 40 miles an hour for 160 miles over the rough and mountainous roads of the Isle of Man. And then if we read further along in the article, we see here, to Gottlieb Daimler occurred the idea of driving a vehicle by an explosion motor. What they really want to say there is a combustion engine. In any event, he was soon turning out motor cars commercially. In shape, they were like horseless carriages. Now, if you go down farther here, there's a very interesting little tidbit here. The question of hot tube or electric spark ignition arose almost at the beginning, Benz having the credit of anticipating the future in this respect. The spark was allowed first as an alternative, being regarded as too tricky to be trusted without burners and tubes as a standby. Slowly it was made more certain, and then its safety and adjustability gave it undisputed preference. So that's sort of an interesting little tidbit that they might have used hot tubes instead of spark ignition. That's really interesting. Now if we take a look at this article, the title of this is Motorcars Commission. A royal commission has investigated the working of the Motorcars Acts, the injury to the roads caused by motor cars, and what charges should be imposed in respect of motor cars, and how the money should be applied. If we take a look down here, here's one of the laws they want to pass. Any general motor car act should deal with traction engines as well as motor cars. The present general speed limit of 20 miles an hour for light motor cars should be abolished. Speed being controlled by Section 1, with some suggested amendments, and in towns and villages and at dangerous corners, steep hills, and similar places where caution is required, by a 12-mile speed limit where adopted by the local authorities. These 12-mile limits should be indicated in small towns and rural districts by danger signal boards. That's an interesting name, danger signal boards. And how about that, a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit? Can you imagine that today? Now, here's an interesting article I found. The shrinkage in distance. The shrinkage in distance is one of the most striking features of our modern civilization. 20 or 30 years ago, it needed the audacity and imagination of Jules Verne to suppose that the circuit of the globe could be accomplished in 70 days. In the immediate future, the circuit of the Earth will be achieved in less than 45 days. Think about that for a second. 45 days. And they're even saying in the immediate future. 121,979 lunatics. Now, can you imagine that title in a newspaper today? There would be all kinds of protests. 10 years ago, there was one madman to every 314 of the population of England and Wales. Today, the proportion is 1 to every 283. And then they go on with all of these stats. The cost of maintaining these lunatics in England and Wales is 14 shillings. In Scotland, 15 shillings. The commissioners say that the alcohol intemperance finds a very prominent place in the causes of lunacy. Intemperance, by the way, was used almost hand in hand with alcoholism. And basically intemperance meant that you could not control yourself. You sort of overindulged in everything. And so again, that was very prominent. You had all these temperance societies trying to keep people in line. Now, here's an interesting article on the world's largest and fastest steamers. Now, you have to remember that's how people pretty much got around in those days, especially if they wanted to travel overseas. Airplanes were just in their infancy. If we take a look at this, the tonnage was a really big deal. And here you can see right in this column, they have registered tonnage. And you can see here this first ship weighs 25,000 tons. And also how many knots the ship could travel per hour. And in this case, it's 17 knots. Now, one thing that's interesting to take a look at here, see White Star right here, they have the second ranked ship. White Star, of course, is the company that in a few years would build the Titanic. But the Titanic did not even exist at this point. Now, if we move down here, we see this little line right here. The following large vessels were launched in 1906, but are not yet in service. That probably means they were undergoing sea trials. But take a look at here. Here's the Lusitania. June 7th, 1906, and it weighed 32,500 tons. So it would be the largest ship of its day. And of course, that is the very famous ship that was sunk by the Germans, causing a huge international incident. But at this point, it wasn't even in service yet. Now, take a look at this interesting little tidbit down here. The Lusitania will not be able to enter New York Harbor until the completion of the Ambrose Channel. And it is estimated that the latter will take 4 years. Now, that's kind of interesting. It would take 4 years to complete that Ambrose Channel in New York. So obviously, if that had not been completed, the Titanic would not have made its journey to New York. Tramps and how to deal with them. Now, can you imagine if this article had been published today? Wow, that would be quite controversial. Now, this deals with the Departmental Committee on the subject of vagrancy. And apparently, they put forth some recommendations in 1906 on how to deal with vagrants. So the article says they put the number of habitual vagrants at 30,000 to 40,000, increased to 70 or 80,000 at times of trade depression. And this is what the committee says as to the problem and its cure. The army of vagrants has increased in numbers of late years, and there is no reason to fear that it will continue to increase if things are left as they are. It is mainly composed of those who deliberately avoid any work, and for their benefit, the industrious portion of the community is heavily taxed. We are convinced that the present system neither deters the vagrant nor affords any means of reclaiming him, and we are of the opinion that a thorough reform is necessary. Briefly, the object of the scheme which we propose is to place the vagrant more under the control of the police. Now, can you imagine that? Putting vagrants under the control of the police. Can you imagine that today? To help the bona fide wayfarer and to provide it a means of detaining the habitual vagrant under reformatory influences. Vagrancy is regarded as an offense against social order, and it is therefore suggested that the task of dealing with it should be handed over to the police, who are controlled by standing joint county committees. A distinction is to be made between the habitual tramp and the genuine work seeker. The tramp is to be detained for 2 nights and to do a good day's work between them. When he starts again, he is to be entitled to a midday meal if he calls for it at the nearest police station. The out of work is only to be detained 1 night and to have a light task set. It is proposed that he be given a certificate book. This man is also to be supplied with a ration of bread and cheese for a midday meal. The police are to help in giving information about work, and if he willfully refuses work, his privileges are withdrawn. Now, can you imagine that today if they put those sort of restrictions on people? And they continue on with this final paragraph. If a man proves to be an habitual vagrant, Power is to be given to commit him for not less than 6 months, nor than 3 years to a certified labor colony. Now that does not sound like a lot of fun. Such as they have in Switzerland, where it is hoped he may reform and perhaps even earn some money. The committee do not think that prison work is a deterrent to the vagrant, and they insist that if labor colonies are set up, real work should be given and exacted, so that the colonies may be self-supporting as in Switzerland. Apparently they're trying to emulate some sort of program that is going on in Switzerland. Now, this is one of the most interesting articles I found about reducing military spending in Britain in 1906. Now, if only they knew what we know now, one of the worst wars in human history was about to occur in 8 years. But nonetheless, they wanted to reduce spending on the military. A strong demand has been put forward for a reduction in national expenditure on armies and navies in the chief European countries. And this has been accompanied by a simultaneous demand for the reference of all disputes to arbitration. Sir Edward Grey says that all the powers are, quote, waiting on each other, end quote, to make the first move. In the House of Commons on May 9, 1906, a resolution was unanimously passed on the motion of Mr. Vivian. Quote, that this House is of the opinion that the growth of expenditure on armaments is excessive and ought to be reduced. Such expenditure lessens national and commercial credit, intensifies the unemployed problem, reduces the resources available for social reform, and presses with exceptional severity on the industrial classes. And it therefore calls upon the government to take drastic steps to reduce the drain on national income. Now, Mr. Balfour apparently opposed this, and he seemed to have some foresight that this was sort of a dangerous thing to do. So let's read on. Mr. Balfour justified the increased expenditure on armaments under his government, and in regard to the question of their reduction, took the line that the initiation must not be taken by Great Britain. Quote, the principle of this country has always been to watch what is being done by foreign countries, not to anticipate them, but to follow them. And foreign countries have only to diminish their fleet building, and they will find under this government, as they would have found, I believe, under the last, that we should follow suit. But as our fleet is for defensive purposes, and their fleet is not for defensive purposes alone, I think he's referring to Germany there, by the way, they are in an essentially different position from what we are. And if there's to be a reduction of armaments, which all must desire, it must begin with those whose armaments are kept up for purposes not purely defensive, end quote. Sir Edward Grey spoke in favor of the resolution. Quote, I do hold that a declaration of this kind from a British House of Commons is something that is worth having, if only for the effect it may have on other governments. It was the original object of the First Hague Conference to do something to reduce expenditure, or at any rate to stop the increase of expenditure. I do, on behalf of the government, not only accept but welcome such a resolution. And then he goes on, and at the end he says, I trust this resolution may be taken as being an invitation from the British House of Commons to respond to their feeling in favor of encouraging a reduction of armaments. Well, I just find this very interesting, given that they were only 8 years away from one of the deadliest wars of all time, and here they are passing a motion to reduce spending on the military. Now, this last article I found is very interesting as well. It talks about what occupations women and men are in 1906. Now, if we take a look at this, some of these are very similar. For instance, both men and women were working as tailors and working in the food industry. You also found men and women working in taverns and inns. But there are some very interesting differences. Take a look up here. General or local government, all men. You don't even see that heading down here for women. And then if we take a look at here, nurses and teaching. I find that very interesting. There's a heading for women, but you don't see teaching or nurses listed under men. So this is another rather interesting article.